The summer, they came home. The morning their mother stopped breathing, two barefoot girls walked out of a silent house and into a heat that had no mercy. Lena was 9, Molly was 7, and the only thing between them and the empty sky was each other. No relatives, no neighbors who cared enough to notice. Just a dusty road that stretched toward nothing, and a ranch in the distance where smoke still rose from a chimney. They didn't know the man who lived there. They didn't know if he'd let them stay. They only knew they had nowhere else to go. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it moves you, hit that like button. Now, let me tell you about the summer two lost girls found home in the last place anyone expected. The sun had been up for less than an hour, but it already felt like punishment. Lena walked with her hand wrapped tight around Molly's wrist, pulling her little sister forward, even when Molly's steps started to drag. The road beneath their feet was packed earth and scattered stone, and every step sent up small clouds of dust that clung to their ankles and the hems of their dresses. The fabric was thin, faded from too many washings, and it stuck to their skin in the places where sweat had already begun to gather. Behind them, the house they'd left was nothing but a shape on the horizon now, a leaning structure with broken shutters and a door that didn't lock. Their mother had been lying on the bed inside, her face turned toward the window, her hands folded across her chest the way Lena had arranged them. There had been no breath left in her, no movement, just silence so thick it had pushed the girls out the door and into the morning. Lena had taken one dress for each of them, a tin cup, and a photograph of their mother holding them both when they were smaller. Everything else she'd left behind. "Lena, I'm thirsty." Molly's voice was small, cracked at the edges. Her lips were chapped, her cheeks flushed from the heat. Lena glanced down at her and saw the way her little sister's eyes kept drifting closed, the way her feet shuffled instead of stepped. "I know," Lena said quietly. "We'll find water soon." She didn't know if that was true. She only knew she had to keep moving. The land around them stretched flat and endless in every direction, broken only by clumps of dry brush and the occasional fence post leaning at an angle. There were no trees, no shade, just the sky pressing down, pale and relentless, and the sun climbing higher with every minute that passed. Lena had no plan beyond putting distance between them and the house. She didn't know where they were going. She didn't know what would happen when the sun set and the air turned cold. All she knew was that staying had felt impossible, and walking had felt like the only choice. Then she saw it. At first it was just a shape in the distance, a dark smudge against the pale land. But as they drew closer, the shape took form. A low ranch house with a sloped roof, a barn set back from the main structure, and a corral where horses stood swishing their tails in the heat. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin, steady line, and somewhere near the barn, chickens clucked and scratched at the dirt. It was the first sign of life they'd seen in hours. Lena stopped walking. Molly bumped into her from behind, swaying on her feet. "What is it?" Molly asked. Lena didn't answer right away. She stood there staring at the ranch, her heart beating hard in her chest. She didn't know who lived there. She didn't know if they'd be kind or cruel, if they'd turn two dirty girls away or let them rest for just a moment. But she knew Molly couldn't walk much farther. She knew the heat was only going to get worse. "Come on," Lena said softly, and she started walking again, pulling Molly toward the ranch. They approached slowly, staying close to the fence line. The house looked sturdy, well kept, with a porch that wrapped around the front and windows that caught the light. The barn was weathered but solid, its doors propped open to let air move through. Near the corral, a black dog lay in the shade, its head resting on its paws. Lena's steps slowed as they reached the edge of the property. Her throat felt tight. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know how to ask for help without sounding desperate, even though desperation was the only thing she felt. The dog lifted its head and looked at them, ears pricked forward. It didn't bark. It just watched. Molly tugged on Lena's hand. "I'm scared." "I know," Lena whispered. "Me too." But before she could decide what to do, the front door of the house opened and a man stepped out onto the porch. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that fell across his forehead, and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. He wore a work shirt with the sleeves rolled up, trousers held up by suspenders, and boots that were scuffed and dusty. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He just stood there, looking at them with eyes that were impossible to read. Lena's instinct was to run, but Molly's hand was trembling in hers, and her legs felt too heavy to carry them any farther. The man took a step forward, then another. He moved with the slow, deliberate caution of someone approaching something fragile. When he reached the edge of the porch, he stopped and crossed his arms over his chest. "You lost?" he asked. His voice was low, rough, like gravel underfoot. Lena swallowed hard. "No, sir." His gaze moved from her to Molly, then back again. "You looking for someone?" "No, sir." He tilted his head slightly, studying them. "Then what are you doing on my land?" Lena didn't know how to answer that. She didn't know how to explain that they had nowhere else to go, that their mother was dead, and there was no one left who cared whether they lived or died. The words stuck in her throat, too big and too terrible to say out loud. Molly swayed on her feet, her eyes fluttering closed. The man saw it. In one smooth motion, he stepped off the porch and crossed the yard. He crouched down in front of Molly, close enough that Lena could see the lines around his eyes, the rough stubble on his jaw. "When's the last time you ate?" he asked quietly. Molly blinked at him, her lips parting but no sound coming out. Lena answered instead. "Yesterday morning." The man's jaw tightened. He stood up slowly, his gaze shifting to the horizon, then back to the girls. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he sighed, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. "Come on," he said, and he turned toward the barn. Lena hesitated. "Sir." "You need water," he said without looking back, "and shade. Barn's got both." He didn't wait to see if they followed. He just walked, his boots crunching against the dirt, his shoulders set in a line that said he wasn't a man who repeated himself. Lena looked down at Molly, then at the barn. She didn't know if this was a mistake. She didn't know if they could trust him. But Molly's face was pale, her breathing shallow, and the sun was climbing higher with every second that passed. She took a breath, tightened her grip on Molly's hand, and followed. The barn was cool and dim, a relief so immediate it made Lena's knees weak. The smell of hay and leather and animal warmth wrapped around them, and somewhere above, dust motes drifted through shafts of light that slanted down from gaps in the roof. The man walked to a water barrel near the back wall, dipped a tin cup into it, and held it out to Molly. "Drink slow," he said. Molly took the cup with both hands and drank like she'd been wandering the desert for days. Water spilled down her chin, soaking the front of her dress, but she didn't stop until the cup was empty. The man refilled it and handed it to Lena. She drank more carefully, watching him over the rim of the cup. He stood with his arms crossed again, his expression unreadable, his gaze fixed somewhere past them toward the open barn doors. When she finished, she handed the cup back. "Thank you." He set it aside without comment. Then he looked at her directly for the first time, and the weight of his attention made her feel like she was being measured. "Where's your folks?" he asked. Lena's throat tightened. "Gone." "Gone where?" "Just gone." His eyes narrowed slightly. "You got anyone looking for you?" "No." "No one at all?" "No, sir." He exhaled slowly through his nose, his jaw working like he was chewing on something bitter. Then he looked at Molly, who had sunk down onto a pile of hay and was already starting to nod off. "You can stay here tonight," he said finally. "In the barn. I'll bring you something to eat." Lena's chest tightened with relief so sharp it almost hurt. "Thank you," she whispered. He gave a single nod, then turned and walked out of the barn without another word. Lena stood there for a long moment, listening to the sound of his boots fading into the distance. Then she sank down beside Molly, wrapped an arm around her sister's shoulders, and let herself breathe. The man's name was Caleb Hart, though Lena didn't learn that until the next morning. He came to the barn at dawn carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. Inside were biscuits, still warm, a jar of honey, and 2 hard-boiled eggs. He set it down without a word, turned to leave, then paused. "There's a pump by the house," he said, his back still to them. "You can wash up if you want." Then he was gone again. Lena and Molly ate in silence, tearing the biscuits into pieces and drizzling honey over them until their fingers were sticky and sweet. It was the best thing Lena had tasted in months, maybe longer, and she had to remind herself to eat slowly, to save some for later in case there wasn't anything else. When they finished, she took Molly's hand and led her out into the early morning light. The air was still cool, the sky pale and soft, and the ranch looked different than it had the day before. Less intimidating, more like a place where people actually lived. The pump stood near the side of the house, its handle worn smooth from use. Lena worked it until water gushed out, cold and clear, and they took turns washing their faces and hands and feet. Molly laughed when the water splashed her dress, a sound so sudden and bright that it startled Lena into stillness. She hadn't heard Molly laugh in weeks. "Feels good, doesn't it?" Lena said softly. Molly nodded, grinning up at her with water dripping from her chin. They were still standing there, dripping and smiling, when Caleb came around the corner of the house. He stopped when he saw them, his expression flickering with something Lena couldn't name. Then he cleared his throat and looked away. "You need clothes," he said. "Those won't last another day." Lena glanced down at their dresses, both of which were torn and stained and threadbare in places. "We don't have any others." "I know." He hesitated, then gestured toward the house. "Come on." He led them inside, through a kitchen that smelled like coffee and wood smoke, and into a small room at the back of the house. It was sparsely furnished, a bed, a trunk, a chair by the window, but it was clean, and the air smelled faintly of lavender. Caleb opened the trunk and pulled out 2 shirts and 2 pairs of trousers, both far too big for the girls. He set them on the bed, then stepped back. "They're mine," he said. "But they'll do until I can get you something proper." Lena stared at the clothes, her throat tight. "Why are you helping us?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at her, his eyes dark and steady. "Because you need it," he said simply, and then he left. The days that followed fell into a rhythm so quiet it felt like a held breath. Caleb didn't ask them to leave. He didn't ask them questions. He simply let them stay, and slowly, carefully, they began to fill the spaces in his life. Lena helped in the kitchen, learning to knead dough and salt meat and keep the stove burning at just the right temperature. Molly fed the chickens, gathered eggs, and followed Caleb around the ranch like a shadow, her small hands mimicking his larger ones as he mended fences and checked the horses. At night, they ate together at a table that had only held 1 plate for years. Caleb didn't say much, but he listened when the girls talked, and sometimes, just sometimes, the corner of his mouth would twitch in something that almost looked like a smile. Lena watched him carefully, trying to understand why he'd let them stay. He was a hard man. She could see that, silent, guarded, built from years of something she didn't have words for yet. But there was a gentleness in the way he handed Molly a piece of carved wood he'd made, in the way he left extra blankets on their beds without comment, in the way he never raised his voice even when things went wrong. One evening, as the sun sank low and the sky turned the color of fire, Lena found him sitting on the porch, a piece of wood in his hands and a knife moving in slow, careful strokes. She sat down beside him, her legs dangling off the edge. "What are you making?" she asked. He glanced at her, then back at the wood. "A horse." She watched his hands move, steady and sure. "You're good at that." He didn't answer. "Mr. Hart?" "Caleb," he said quietly. "Just Caleb." "Caleb," she repeated, testing the name, then softer. "Why did you let us stay?" His hands stilled. For a long moment he didn't move, didn't speak. Then he set the wood and knife aside and leaned back, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I had a daughter once," he said, his voice so low she almost didn't hear it. "She'd be about your age now." Lena's breath caught. "What happened to her?" "Fever took her. Took my wife, too." He paused, his jaw tight. "Left me with a house too big and a life too quiet." Lena didn't know what to say. She sat there beside him, feeling the weight of his grief like a stone in her chest. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Caleb looked at her then, really looked at her, and something in his expression softened. "You don't have anything to be sorry for," he said. "You didn't do anything wrong." But Lena felt like she had. She felt like she was taking something that didn't belong to her, this place, this man's kindness, this fragile sense of safety that wrapped around her like a blanket. "We can leave if you want," she said quietly. "If we're too much trouble." Caleb's expression shifted, something sharp and almost fierce flickering in his eyes. "You're not trouble," he said firmly. "And you're not leaving." Lena blinked at him, startled by the certainty in his voice. "Not unless you want to," he added, softer. "But if you stay because this is home, not because you've got nowhere else to go." Lena's throat tightened. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that home could be something other than a place you were born, something other than blood and obligation. "Okay," she whispered. Caleb nodded once, then picked up the wood and knife again, his hands moving in the same steady rhythm as before, and Lena sat beside him, watching the sun sink lower, feeling something fragile and precious begin to take root in her chest. But peace, Lena was learning, was never guaranteed to last. The first sign came on a Saturday morning when Caleb rode into town for supplies and returned with a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. He didn't say anything at first. He just unloaded the wagon in silence, his movement sharp and clipped, his jaw set in a hard line. Lena watched from the porch, a knot forming in her stomach. "Caleb?" she called. "Is something wrong?" He didn't answer right away. He finished stacking the last of the supplies, then turned to face her, his hands resting on his hips. "People are talking," he said quietly. Lena's stomach dropped. "About what?" "About you and Molly. About why you're here." She stood up slowly, her heart beating hard. "What are they saying?" Caleb's expression darkened. "Things that aren't any of their business." Lena felt a cold weight settle in her chest. She'd known this was coming. She'd known people would notice, would question, would judge. She just hadn't expected it to happen so soon. "Do we need to leave?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Caleb's eyes snapped to hers, fierce and unyielding. "No," he said firmly. "You don't." But the look on his face told her that the fight had only just begun. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with a promise Lena wasn't sure Caleb could keep. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust that his certainty was enough to hold back whatever storm was building in town. But she'd learned young that wanting something didn't make it true, and the tight set of his jaw told her he knew it too. "What exactly did they say?" Lena asked, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. Caleb turned away, running a hand through his hair in a gesture that spoke of frustration barely held in check. "Nothing worth repeating." "Caleb." He stopped, his back still to her, his shoulders rising and falling with a breath that seemed to cost him something. When he spoke again, his voice was low and rough. "They're questioning why a man living alone would take in two girls who aren't his kin. They're using words like improper and suspicious." He turned then, and the anger in his eyes was a living thing. "They're implying things that make me want to—" He cut himself off, his hands curling into fists at his sides. Lena felt heat rise in her cheeks, shame and anger twisting together in her chest. She understood what he wasn't saying. She'd heard whispers like that before, seen the way people looked at things they didn't understand with suspicion instead of kindness. "Maybe they're right," she said quietly. "Maybe it isn't proper." "Proper," Caleb spat the word like it tasted bitter. "Proper would have been leaving you and your sister to die on that road. Proper would have been turning away two children who had nothing and no one." He took a step toward her, his gaze fierce. "If that's what proper looks like, then I want no part of it." Lena's throat tightened. "But if people think—" "I don't care what people think." "You should." The words came out sharper than she intended. "Because if they decide you're doing something wrong, they'll take us away. And then what?" The question hung between them like a weight. Caleb's expression shifted, the anger draining away to leave something harder and colder behind. "They won't take you," he said, but his voice lacked the certainty it had held before. Lena wanted to believe him, but she'd seen what happened when people decided something wasn't right. She'd seen neighbors turn away from her mother when things got hard, seen the way doors closed and help disappeared when it was needed most. She knew that reputation mattered more than truth in small towns, and that once people started talking, stopping them was like trying to hold back a river with your bare hands. "We should be careful," she said quietly. We should— The sound of hoofbeats cut her off. They both turned toward the road, where a small group of riders approached in a cloud of dust. 3 men, all dressed in dark suits despite the heat, their faces shadowed beneath broad-brimmed hats. They rode with the kind of purpose that made Lena's stomach clench with dread. Caleb's hand moved to her shoulder, a brief touch that was both reassurance and warning. "Go inside, get Molly, and stay there until I come for you." "But now, Lena." The steel in his voice left no room for argument. Lena turned and ran for the house, her heart hammering against her ribs. She found Molly in the kitchen, kneeling on a chair while she helped knead bread dough, flour dusting her nose and cheeks. "Come with me," Lena said, grabbing her sister's hand. "But the bread— Leave it." She pulled Molly down the hallway to the small room they shared, the one that had once belonged to Caleb's daughter. Through the window, she could see the men dismounting, could see Caleb standing on the porch with his arms crossed, his posture radiating a warning that was impossible to miss. "What's happening?" Molly whispered, pressing close to Lena's side. "I don't know, but we need to be quiet." The voices carried through the open window, distorted by distance but clear enough to make out the words. "Mr. Hart." The speaker was a tall man with silver hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. "I'm Thomas Beckwith, County Commissioner. These are my associates, Mr. Crawford and Mr. Mills." "I know who you are." Caleb's voice was flat, emotionless. "What do you want?" "We've had some concerns brought to our attention. Concerns regarding 2 young girls reportedly living on your property." "They're here. What of it?" Beckwith's tone took on a practiced patience, the kind used to talk to children or fools. "Mr. Hart, I'm sure you understand the delicate nature of this situation. A single man, living alone, taking in 2 unrelated children without any formal arrangement or oversight, it raises questions. Only for people looking to make trouble where there isn't any. We're not here to make trouble. We're here to ensure the welfare of these children." Beckwith shifted his weight, his boots scraping against the porch boards. "Where did they come from? Do they have family? Have you made any effort to locate their next of kin?" Lena's hands tightened around Molly's. She could hear the trap in those questions, the way they were designed to make Caleb look careless or worse. "Their mother died," Caleb said. "They had no one else. I gave them shelter because that's what decent people do." "Admirable sentiment," Crawford interjected, his voice thinner and sharper than Beckwith's. "But sentiment doesn't change the fact that this arrangement is highly irregular. 2 young girls living under the roof of a man who has no legal or familial connection to them. Surely you can see how this appears." "I can see how it appears to people with dirty minds, and nothing better to do than poke into business that isn't theirs." Beckwith's tone hardened. "Mr. Hart, I'd advise you to watch your tongue. We're operating within our authority here. The county has a responsibility to ensure that children are placed in appropriate homes. This is an appropriate home. That's not for you to decide." The silence that followed was thick with tension. Lena could see Caleb's hands curling into fists at his sides, could see the rigid set of his shoulders. "What exactly are you proposing?" Caleb asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "We're proposing that the girls be removed from your care and placed in a more suitable environment. There's an orphanage in Cheyenne that—" "No!" The word came out like a gunshot, sharp and final. Beckwith sighed. "Mr. Hart, you're not their father. You have no legal claim to these children. If you continue to resist, we'll have no choice but to involve the territorial marshal." "Then involve him." "But those girls aren't leaving." Lena felt Molly trembling against her side. She wanted to run out there, to tell those men that they were wrong, that Caleb had saved them, that this was their home now. But she knew it wouldn't matter. She knew that men like Beckwith didn't care about the truth. They cared about rules and propriety and maintaining the order of things. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," Mills said, speaking for the first time. His voice was softer than the others, almost sympathetic. "We're not trying to punish you. We're trying to do what's right for those children. What's right for them is staying here, where they're fed and safe and cared for. With a man who has no wife, no female presence to provide proper guidance?" Beckwith shook his head. "Surely you can see how untenable that is." "Then I'll find a wife." The words fell into the space between them, like stones dropped into still water. Lena's breath caught in her throat. Beside her, Molly went very still. Beckwith raised an eyebrow. You'll find a wife. That's what I said. And you have someone in mind? Caleb hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Beckwith's expression shifted, something almost like satisfaction crossing his features. I see. So this is a hypothetical solution to a very real problem. He stepped forward, his voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a verdict. Mr. Hart, we'll give you 1 week to make proper arrangements for these children. If, at the end of that week, their situation hasn't been rectified to our satisfaction, we'll return with the authority to remove them. Do I make myself clear? Caleb said nothing. 1 week, Beckwith repeated. Then he turned, gestured to the other men, and they mounted their horses in synchronized motion. We'll see ourselves out. Lena watched them ride away, their figures growing smaller against the horizon until they disappeared entirely. Only then did Caleb move, his shoulders sagging like a man who'd been holding up a tremendous weight. She waited until the dust had settled, until the silence felt safe again, before she led Molly out of the room and down the hallway. Caleb was still standing on the porch, staring at the place where the men had been, his expression carved from stone. Caleb, Lena's voice came out small. He turned to look at her, and for the first time since they'd met, she saw something that looked like defeat in his eyes. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I should have known this would happen. Should have been more careful. This isn't your fault. Isn't it? He let out a harsh breath. I brought you here. I kept you here. And now? He broke off, shaking his head. Molly stepped forward, her small hand reaching for his. Are they going to take us away? Caleb knelt down so he was eye level with her, his large hand closing gently around hers. Not if I can help it. But you said you'd find a wife. Molly's eyes were wide, confused. Do you have someone? Caleb's jaw tightened. No, little one, I don't. The admission hung in the air, heavy with implications Lena was only beginning to understand. 1 week. They had 1 week to find a solution to a problem that seemed impossible to solve. That night, sleep eluded all of them. Lena lay in the darkness, listening to Molly's breathing beside her, feeling the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her chest like a physical thing. She kept replaying Beckwith's words, kept seeing the cold certainty in his eyes when he delivered his ultimatum. 1 week. 7 days to upend everything or lose it all. She heard footsteps in the hallway, the familiar creak of floorboards that meant Caleb was pacing. She wondered what he was thinking, whether he was angry or afraid or simply resigned to the inevitable. She wondered if he regretted taking them in, if he wished he'd turned them away that first day and saved himself this trouble. But even as the thought crossed her mind, she knew it wasn't true. Whatever else Caleb Hart was, he wasn't the kind of man who regretted kindness. Morning came too soon and too slowly all at once. Lena woke to find pale light filtering through the curtains and Molly still asleep beside her, one arm thrown across her face. She dressed quietly, pulled her hair back with trembling fingers, and made her way to the kitchen. Caleb was already there, standing by the stove with a cup of coffee in his hands. He looked like he hadn't slept at all. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his hair stuck up at odd angles like he'd been running his hands through it all night. Morning? Lena said softly. He glanced at her, managed something that might have been a smile. Morning. She poured herself a cup of coffee, added more sugar than she usually took, and sat down at the table. The silence between them felt different than it usually did, heavier, weighted with things neither of them knew how to say. I've been thinking, Caleb said finally, his voice rough from disuse. Lena looked up. About what? About what Beckwith said. About finding a wife. He set his cup down, his fingers drumming against the table in a restless rhythm. It's not as crazy as it sounds. Lena's heart gave a strange lurch. You mean you'd actually... If it meant keeping you and Molly safe, I'd do a lot of things. He met her gaze, his eyes dark and serious. The question is whether I can find someone willing in less than a week. That's not much time. No, it's not. Lena turned the cup in her hands, watching the coffee swirl. Would it have to be real? The marriage, I mean. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. I don't know. Maybe it would depend on the person. And you really don't have anyone in mind? No. The word came out flat, final. My wife died 5 years ago. Haven't looked at another woman since. There was something in his voice that made Lena's chest ache. She thought about what it must be like to love someone so much that losing them left you hollow, unable to imagine filling that space with anyone else. She thought about her own mother, about the way grief had carved her out from the inside until there was nothing left but exhaustion and surrender. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, "for all of this, for being a burden." Caleb's head snapped up. "You're not a burden." "We are. You know we are. If we weren't here, you wouldn't be facing any of this. If you weren't here, I'd still be living in a house that felt like a tomb." His voice was fierce, almost angry. "You and Molly, you brought life back into this place. You made it feel like a home again. Don't you dare apologize for that." Lena blinked hard against the sudden burn in her eyes. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that their presence here mattered, that it was worth something more than trouble and complications. Before she could respond, there was a knock at the door. They both froze. Caleb stood slowly, his hand moving instinctively to the rifle that hung above the mantel. But when he opened the door, it wasn't the commissioner or his associate standing there. It was a woman. She was tall and slender, with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes the color of creek water in summer. She wore a simple dress in a shade of blue that matched the sky, and she carried a basket over one arm. When she saw Caleb, she smiled, a quick, uncertain thing that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Eliza, well," Caleb said, surprise evident in his voice. "What are you doing here?" "I heard what happened yesterday," the woman, Eliza, said. Her voice was soft but steady, with an undertone of steel that reminded Lena of her mother. "I thought you might need a friend." Caleb stepped back, gesturing for her to come in. Eliza entered with the kind of quiet confidence that came from being comfortable in her own skin, and her gaze immediately found Lena standing by the table. "You must be Lena," she said, setting the basket down. "I'm Eliza Rowan. I run the general store in town." Lena nodded, suddenly very aware of her wrinkled dress and the fact that she probably had flour in her hair from yesterday's bread making. "Nice to meet you, ma'am." "Please, call me Eliza." She turned back to Caleb. "Where's the other one? Molly?" "Still sleeping," Caleb said. He crossed his arms, his expression guarded. "How did you hear about yesterday?" Thomas Beckwith's wife came into the store this morning, crowing about how they'd finally put a stop to that improper situation out at the Hart Ranch. Eliza's mouth tightened. "I wanted to come out here and see if there was anything I could do to help." Caleb's shoulders relaxed slightly. "That's kind of you, but I'm not sure there's much anyone can do." "Beckwith gave you a week, didn't he, to make proper arrangements?" "He did." "Then we have a week to figure something out." Eliza pulled out a chair and sat down like she owned the place, her hands folded calmly on the table. "Tell me exactly what he said." Lena watched the exchange with growing curiosity. There was a familiarity between Caleb and Eliza that spoke of old friendship, maybe something more. The way Eliza looked at him, the way Caleb's guard dropped in her presence, it was the kind of thing you only saw between people who'd known each other a long time. Caleb recounted the conversation, his voice flat and emotionless. When he got to the part about finding a wife, Eliza's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes, something Lena couldn't quite read. "So that's the solution they're proposing," Eliza said when he finished. "A wife to make things respectable." "It's not a real solution. It's a trap." Caleb ran a hand through his hair. "Even if I could find someone willing, Beckwith would just find some other reason to object." "Maybe. Maybe not." Eliza tilted her head, studying him. "What if you didn't have to find someone?" Caleb frowned. "What do you mean?" "What if someone was already here, already willing?" She said it calmly, like she was discussing the weather or the price of flour. "What if I married you?" The silence that followed was absolute. Lena's heart stopped. She looked from Eliza to Caleb and back again, trying to understand what she was hearing. Caleb stared at Eliza like she'd just suggested they set the house on fire. "You can't be serious." "Why not?" Eliza's voice remained steady, reasonable. "We've known each other for years. We're friends. And I'm respectable enough that even Beckwith couldn't object to me as a wife and guardian for the girls." "Eliza, think about it, Caleb. It solves everything. The girls get to stay, you keep your ranch, and Beckwith loses his leverage. But you'd be giving up. Caleb broke off, shaking his head. You'd be tying yourself to me to this situation without anything in return. Who says I wouldn't get anything in return? Eliza leaned forward, her gaze intent. I'm 32 years old, Caleb. I've been running that store by myself for 10 years and I'm tired. Tired of being alone, tired of being the spinster shopkeeper that people feel sorry for. Her voice softened. Maybe this isn't a love match, but it could be a partnership, and that's more than most people get. Lena found herself holding her breath, watching Caleb's face for some sign of what he was thinking. He looked stunned, overwhelmed, like someone had just knocked the ground out from under him. I can't ask you to do this, he said finally. You're not asking. I'm offering. Eliza reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Let me help you, Caleb. Let me help these girls, please. The please did something to him. Lena saw it in the way his shoulders sagged, in the way his hand turned beneath Eliza's to hold it instead of pulling away. You're sure? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm sure. Lena felt something shift in the room, some invisible weight settling into place. She didn't fully understand what was happening, didn't know if this was desperation or kindness or something in between. But she could see the relief in Caleb's eyes, could see the quiet determination in Eliza's expression, and she knew that whatever this was, it might be their only chance. When? Caleb asked. Today, if possible. The sooner we make it official, the less room Beckwith has to maneuver. Eliza squeezed his hand once, then let go. I'll go back to town, make the arrangements. You stay here with the girls. We'll do this properly, but we'll do it fast. She stood, smoothed her skirts, and picked up her basket. Then she turned to Lena with a smile that was warmer than anything Lena had seen from her yet. I'm looking forward to getting to know you both, she said, really getting to know you. Then she was gone, the door closing softly behind her, leaving Caleb and Lena sitting in the morning light with the remnants of their coffee and the weight of what had just happened. Is she really going to marry you? Lena asked into the silence. Caleb let out a long breath. Seems like it. Do you love her? He was quiet for a long time. I care about her. She's a good woman, and right now that might have to be enough. Lena thought about that, about how love was supposed to be this grand, overwhelming thing, but sometimes survival required settling for less. Sometimes kindness and mutual respect had to be enough, because the alternative was losing everything. She seems nice, Lena offered. Caleb's mouth quirked in something that wasn't quite a smile. She is. Better than I deserve, probably. He looked at Lena then, really looked at her. Are you all right with this? With her coming here, being part of things? Lena considered the question honestly. She thought about Eliza's steady voice, her calm determination, the way she'd looked at Caleb with something that might have been affection or might have just been pragmatism. I think so, she said. I think she might be exactly what we need. And somewhere deep in her chest, beneath all the fear and uncertainty, Lena felt the first small flutter of something that might have been hope. The hours that followed moved with a strange combination of urgency and stillness, like watching storm clouds gather on a horizon that seemed both impossibly distant and dangerously close. Caleb paced the length of the porch while Lena tried to explain to Molly what was happening, searching for words that would make sense to a 7-year-old when she wasn't entirely sure she understood it herself. So Miss Eliza is going to live here? Molly asked, sitting cross-legged on the bed with her worn doll clutched in her lap. Yes, Lena said carefully. She's going to marry Caleb, which means she'll be part of our family. Like a mother? The word caught in Lena's throat. Something like that. Molly was quiet for a moment, her small fingers twisting the doll's fabric dress. Will she be nice to us? I think so. She seemed kind. But what if she's not? What if she doesn't want us here? Lena pulled Molly close, wrapping her arms around her sister's thin shoulders. Then we'll deal with it, together, like we always do. But even as she said the words, doubt gnawed at her. They were placing their entire future in the hands of a woman they'd met for all of 5 minutes, trusting that her offer came from genuine kindness and not some hidden agenda they couldn't yet see. It was a gamble, and the stakes were everything they had. The sound of hoofbeats brought both girls to the window. A small buggy approached from town, pulled by a single dark horse. Eliza sat in the driver's seat, her blue dress replaced now with something finer, pale green silk that caught the afternoon light, with lace at the collar and cuffs. Beside her sat a man in black, older, with white hair and a lined face that suggested he'd witnessed more weddings than he could count. "That must be the minister," Lena murmured. They watched as Caleb walked out to meet them. His own clothes changed now, too. He wore a clean white shirt and dark trousers, his hair combed back, his boots polished. He looked different like this. Formal, almost uncomfortable, like a man wearing someone else's skin. Eliza climbed down from the buggy with practiced grace, and the minister followed more slowly, his movements stiff with age. Words were exchanged that Lena couldn't hear, and then all three of them turned toward the house. "Come on," Lena said, taking Molly's hand. "We should go down." They descended the stairs to find Caleb standing in the main room, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his jaw tight. Eliza stood near the fireplace, and the minister had positioned himself in the center of the room, a worn Bible held in his weathered hands. "Ah, the young ones," the minister said when he saw the girls. His voice was soft, warm with a kindness that seemed genuine. "I'm Reverend Michaels. You must be Lena and Molly." "Yes, sir," Lena said quietly. "Miss Rowan tells me you've been staying with Mr. Hart here and that there's been some trouble in town about the arrangement." Lena glanced at Caleb, but his expression was unreadable. "Yes, sir." Reverend Michaels nodded slowly. "Well, I've known Caleb Hart since he first came to this territory, and I've known Eliza Rowan even longer. If these two have decided this is the right course, then I'm inclined to trust their judgment." He looked at Eliza. "Though I confess I'm surprised. I didn't know you two were courting." "We weren't," Eliza said simply. "But circumstances have a way of clarifying what matters." The Reverend's eyebrows rose, but he didn't press. Instead, he opened his Bible and cleared his throat. "Shall we begin, then?" What followed was the strangest ceremony Lena had ever witnessed. There was no music, no flowers, no gathering of friends and family. Just four people standing in a quiet room while an old man read words that would bind two lives together for reasons that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with survival. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Michaels began, his voice taking on the practiced cadence of ritual. "We are gathered here today to join Caleb Hart and Eliza Rowan in holy matrimony." Lena watched Caleb's face as the Reverend spoke. He stood rigid, his hands no longer in his pockets but clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on some point beyond Eliza's shoulder. He looked like a man facing a firing squad, resigned, determined, but not quite present. Eliza, by contrast, seemed perfectly calm. Her hands rested loosely at her sides, her expression serene, like this was something she'd thought through from every angle and made her peace with. "Marriage is not to be entered into lightly," the Reverend continued, "but reverently, deliberately, and in accordance with the purposes for which it was instituted." The irony of those words in this context wasn't lost on Lena. There was nothing reverent about this marriage, nothing deliberate beyond the cold calculation of necessity. It was a transaction dressed up in holy language, a shield against judgment wielded by people who cared more about appearances than actual welfare. "Caleb," the Reverend said, "do you take Eliza to be your lawfully wedded wife? To have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" Caleb's jaw worked. His eyes finally met Eliza's, and something passed between them. Acknowledgement, perhaps, or simply acceptance of what they were doing. "I do," he said, his voice rough but clear. "And Eliza, do you take Caleb to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" Eliza's answer came without hesitation. "I do." The Reverend produced two simple gold bands from his pocket. "These rings are symbols of the unbroken circle of love, a reminder that marriage is a journey that two people take together." Caleb took the smaller ring with fingers that trembled slightly. He reached for Eliza's hand and she gave it to him without hesitation. The ring slid onto her finger like it had been made for her, though Lena suspected it had been purchased in haste that very afternoon. When it was Eliza's turn, she took Caleb's hand with both of hers, steadying it before she slipped the band onto his finger. The gesture was tender, in a way that surprised Lena, intimate despite the circumstances. "By the power vested in me by this territory and before these witnesses," Reverend Michaels said, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." He paused, a small smile crossing his weathered face. "You may kiss the bride." The silence that followed stretched thin and uncomfortable. Caleb leaned forward slowly, like a man walking through deep water. Eliza tilted her face up to meet him. Their lips touched for barely a second, the barest brush of contact that could technically be called a kiss but contained none of the passion such moments were supposed to hold. When they pulled apart, Eliza's cheeks were faintly pink, and Caleb looked like he'd just survived something harrowing. "Congratulations," the Reverend said warmly. "May your union be blessed with happiness and understanding." He produced a certificate from his coat pocket, filled it out with careful script, and had both Caleb and Eliza sign it. Then he turned to Lena and Molly. "And you two young ladies are the reason for all this, I understand." Lena felt her face heat. "We didn't mean to cause trouble." "I don't imagine you did. Trouble has a way of finding people whether they go looking for it or not." He handed the certificate to Caleb. "Keep that safe. You'll want to show it to Commissioner Beckwith when he comes calling again." "Thank you, Reverend," Caleb said, his voice tight. "No need for thanks. I'm just glad to see you settling down again, even if the circumstances are unusual." He gathered his Bible and headed for the door, then paused. "Miss Rowan, forgive me, Mrs. Hart. Your buggy is still outside. Shall I take it back to town for you?" Eliza glanced at Caleb, a question in her eyes. "Leave it," Caleb said. "You'll need it to go back and forth to the store." Something flickered across Eliza's face. Surprise, maybe, or gratitude. "Thank you." The Reverend nodded and left, and then it was just the four of them standing in the gathering twilight, bound together now by law and necessity, and the desperate hope that it would be enough. Molly broke the silence. "Are you really married now?" Eliza turned to her with a soft smile. "We really are." "Does that mean you're our mother?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Eliza's smile faltered for just a moment before she knelt down so she was eye level with Molly. "I'm your guardian now," she said gently. "What that means beyond that, well, I suppose that's something we'll all figure out together. If you want to call me Eliza, that's fine. If you want to call me something else, we can talk about that too." Molly considered this with the seriousness only children could bring to such matters. "Can I think about it?" "Of course you can." Lena watched the exchange with a tightness in her chest. Eliza was being careful, she realized. Not pushing, not demanding, just offering space for things to develop naturally. It was more than she'd dared hope for. "I should bring my things in from the buggy," Eliza said, standing, "and we should probably discuss sleeping arrangements." Caleb's shoulders tensed. "Right, I'll help with the buggy." They went outside together, leaving Lena and Molly alone in the dimming light. "Do you like her?" Molly whispered. Lena thought about it carefully. "I think I might, but it's too soon to tell." "She has kind eyes." "She does." "Do you think Caleb likes her?" That was a harder question. Lena had seen the way Caleb looked at Eliza, not with love exactly, but with something that might have been respect. Trust, maybe. The foundation of something that could become more, given time. "I think he trusts her," Lena said. "And right now, that might be more important than liking." Outside, she could hear the murmur of voices as Caleb and Eliza unloaded her belongings. A trunk, several bags, a crate of what sounded like dishes or glassware. The sounds of a life being transplanted, roots being pulled up and set down somewhere new. When they came back inside, Caleb was carrying the trunk, and Eliza had her arms full of linens. They set everything down in the main room, and for a moment no one seemed to know what to say. "I'll take the spare room," Eliza said finally, her voice steady. "The one at the end of the hall, if that's all right." Caleb's relief was visible. "That's fine. And tomorrow I'll need to go back to town to make arrangements for the store. I'll need to hire someone to run it while I'm here, at least until we figure out a more permanent solution." "You don't have to give up the store." Eliza smiled, but there was something sad in it. "I don't have to, but Beckwith will be watching, looking for any sign that this marriage isn't legitimate. If I'm never here, if I keep living my old life like nothing's changed, he'll use it against you." "Against us," Caleb corrected quietly. The word seemed to mean something to Eliza. Her expression softened. "Against us," she agreed. They stood there in the fading light, this makeshift family bound together by circumstance and legal documents, and Lena wondered if this was how all families started. Not with love and intention, but with need and the desperate hope that maybe, somehow, it would all work out. That night, sleep came slowly for everyone. Lena lay in the darkness, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house settling around Eliza's presence. Footsteps in the hall, the creak of bed springs in the spare room, the low murmur of voices from somewhere below, though she couldn't make out the words. She thought about what would happen when Beckwith returned, whether he'd accept this marriage or find some new way to challenge it. She thought about Eliza, alone in a strange room in a house that wasn't really hers, bound to a man she clearly cared for but didn't love. She thought about Caleb, wearing a ring he'd never expected to wear again, carrying the weight of responsibility for 3 lives that had appeared in his world like ghosts. Beside her, Molly shifted in her sleep, making small sounds that might have been words or might have been nothing at all. Lena closed her eyes and tried to quiet the storm of thoughts in her head. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Tonight, all she could do was hold on to the fragile safety they'd managed to build and hope it would be enough. Morning arrived with the smell of coffee and something else. Bread, maybe, or bacon. Lena woke to find Molly already gone, her side of the bed cold. She dressed quickly and made her way downstairs to find Eliza in the kitchen, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who knew her way around a stove. "Good morning," Eliza said without turning around. "I hope you don't mind. I couldn't sleep, so I thought I'd make myself useful." "It smells good," Lena offered. "Breakfast is nearly ready. Can you set the table?" Lena moved to the cupboard where the plates were kept, pulling down 4 instead of the usual 3. The small change felt significant, like a marker of how everything had shifted overnight. Molly was already at the table, swinging her legs and chattering to Caleb about a dream she'd had. Caleb sat with his coffee, nodding at appropriate intervals, but his attention kept drifting to the kitchen where Eliza worked. When Eliza brought the food to the table, eggs and bacon and fresh bread still warm from the oven, Caleb finally spoke. "You didn't have to do all this." "I know," Eliza said, sitting down, "but it felt strange to just sit in my room waiting for someone else to start the day." They ate in relative silence, the kind that wasn't quite comfortable but wasn't hostile either. Lena noticed the way Eliza watched them all, taking in the small details of how they moved around each other, what they liked to eat, how they interacted. She was learning them, Lena realized, figuring out the rhythms of this household so she could find her place within it. "I'll need to go to town today," Eliza said when they'd finished eating, "to arrange for someone to manage the store." "I'll go with you," Caleb said. Eliza shook her head. "Better if I go alone. If we're seen together too much right away, it'll look like we're trying too hard to convince people. And if you're seen alone, they'll say you've already left me. Then let them talk. We have the marriage certificate. We have witnesses. Whatever rumors they want to spread don't change the facts." She stood, began gathering plates. "Besides, I need to face them eventually. Might as well be now, on my terms." There was steel beneath the gentle exterior, Lena thought. Eliza had agreed to this arrangement, but she wasn't going to be passive about it. She was going to meet it head on, with her chin up and her shoulders back. "At least take one of the horses," Caleb said. "Leave the buggy here." Eliza considered this, then nodded. "All right." An hour later, she rode out dressed in practical traveling clothes, her fine wedding dress packed away. Lena watched from the porch as she disappeared down the road toward town and felt a strange mixture of admiration and worry. "She's braver than she looks," Caleb said from behind her. Lena turned to find him standing in the doorway, his expression thoughtful. "You've known her a long time." "Since I first came to the territory. She was one of the first people to treat me like I belonged instead of like an outsider." He leaned against the doorframe. "Her husband died about 8 years ago, cholera. Left her with the store and not much else." "Did you ever think about—" Lena stopped, not sure how to finish the question. "Courting her?" Caleb shook his head. She deserved better than a man still half in love with a ghost. Still does, probably. But she chose this anyway. She did. His voice was quiet, thoughtful. I'm not sure I'll ever understand why. Lena thought she might understand, just a little. Eliza had been alone for 8 years, watching life pass by while she ran a store and kept herself carefully separate from the possibility of connection. Maybe this arrangement, practical as it was, gave her permission to want something more. Maybe it was easier to step into a marriage of convenience than to risk her heart on something that might not work out. Or maybe she was just kind, and kindness sometimes looked like sacrifice. The day passed slowly. Caleb worked on repairing a section of fence while Lena helped Molly with her letters, using a piece of charcoal and smooth boards in place of proper slate and chalk. They were halfway through the alphabet when they heard hoofbeats again. But it wasn't Eliza who rode up to the house. It was Thomas Beckwith, flanked by the same 2 men who'd accompanied him before. They sat on their horses like judges preparing to deliver a verdict, their faces set in expressions of grim satisfaction. Caleb must have seen them coming because he appeared from around the side of the house before they'd even dismounted, his hammer still in his hand. "Commissioner," he said, his voice flat. "Didn't expect to see you for another 6 days." "I heard some interesting news in town this morning," Beckwith said, swinging down from his horse. "Rumor has it you got married yesterday." "It's not a rumor. It's a fact." "Is that so?" Beckwith's tone suggested he didn't believe it. "And who's the lucky bride?" "Eliza Rowan. Or Eliza Hart now." Something flickered across Beckwith's face. Surprise, maybe, or calculation. "Eliza Rowan married you?" "She did. Reverend Michaels performed the ceremony right here in this house. We have the certificate if you'd like to see it." Beckwith exchanged glances with his companions. Crawford looked skeptical, Mills merely curious. "That was quick," Crawford said. "Awful quick, considering you supposedly had a week to make arrangements." "I had a week or less. I chose less." Caleb crossed his arms, the hammer still dangling from one hand. "Is there a problem with that?" "The problem," Beckwith said slowly, "is that it's convenient. Too convenient. A bachelor with questionable custody of 2 children suddenly produces a wife the day after we confront him? Not the day after, 3 days after. And she's not produced. She's standing of her own free will, making her own choices. Is she here?" Beckwith looked around as if expecting Eliza to materialize. "I'd like to speak with her." "She's in town, managing her business." Beckwith's eyebrows rose. "Her business? So this marriage hasn't actually changed anything. She's still living her separate life, and you're still here alone with these children." Lena felt her stomach drop. She'd been right. They were going to use every detail, every choice, as ammunition. "She's making arrangements to hire someone to run the store so she can be here," Caleb said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "It's been less than 24 hours. What exactly did you expect?" "I expected," Beckwith said, "that if this marriage were legitimate, your new wife would be here, acting like a wife and mother rather than conducting business as usual. She is here. She was here this morning. She'll be here tonight. But she's not here now." The words hung in the air like a threat. Caleb's hand tightened around the hammer's handle. "You're reaching, Beckwith. Reaching for reasons to object because you can't stand the idea that I solved your problem in a way you didn't anticipate. I'm doing my job, which is to ensure the welfare of these children. No, you're doing your job, which is to assert control over things that don't concern you because it makes you feel important." Caleb took a step forward, and Beckwith's companions shifted uneasily. "I've followed your terms. I've made proper arrangements. If you have a legitimate objection, state it clearly. Otherwise, get off my land." For a long moment, no one moved. Then, from down the road came the sound of approaching hoofbeats. They all turned to see Eliza riding toward them, her posture straight and her expression calm despite the fact that she was clearly riding faster than was entirely safe. She brought her horse to a stop in a spray of dust and dismounted in one fluid motion. "Commissioner Beckwith," she said, her voice cool and steady. "I see you've decided to pay us another visit." Beckwith's expression shifted, uncertainty crossing his features. "Mrs. Hart, or should I still call you Miss Rowan?" "Mrs. Hart will do nicely, thank you." She moved to stand beside Caleb, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. I understand you have concerns about the legitimacy of our marriage. I have questions. Then ask them. I have nothing to hide. Beckwith seemed momentarily thrown by her directness. He recovered quickly, but the advantage had shifted. I find it unusual that you would marry Mr. Hart with such haste, especially given that there's been no indication of courtship between you. We're adults, Commissioner. We don't require prolonged courtship to recognize compatibility and shared values. Eliza's tone remained pleasant, but there was an edge to it. Caleb needed a wife. I needed a partner. We've known each other for years and we respect each other. That's more than many marriages start with. And the children? You're prepared to take on the responsibility of raising 2 girls who aren't your own? I'm prepared to care for 2 children who need a stable home. Eliza glanced at the porch where Lena and Molly stood watching. They're good girls who've been through more hardship than any child should have to endure. If I can give them safety and security, then yes, I'm more than prepared. Crawford spoke up. But you're still running your store. How do you plan to manage both a business and a household? The same way women have been managing multiple responsibilities since the beginning of time. I'm hiring help for the store, and I'll divide my time between town and here as needed. She tilted her head slightly. Unless you're suggesting that married women shouldn't engage in commerce? The trap was neat and effective. If Crawford agreed, he'd be insulting half the territory's businesswomen. If he disagreed, he had no grounds to criticize her choices. He said nothing. Beckwith tried a different approach. Where did you sleep last night, Mrs. Hart? The question was invasive, inappropriate, and calculated to embarrass. But Eliza didn't flinch. In the spare room at the end of the hall, she said calmly. Not that it's any of your business, but my husband and I have agreed to take things slowly, given the circumstances of our marriage. I'm sure you can understand that. Some might say that suggests the marriage isn't. Some might say a lot of things, Commissioner. Eliza's voice took on a sharper edge. But unless you're prepared to inspect the bedsheets like some medieval inquisitor, I suggest you accept that our private arrangements are exactly that. Private. Lena saw Caleb's mouth twitch in what might have been the beginning of a smile. Beckwith's face flushed red. I'm simply trying to establish. You're trying to find grounds to remove these children from a home where they're fed, clothed, safe, and cared for. Eliza took a step forward. I've known you for 10 years, Thomas. I've sold you flour and coffee and tobacco every week. I've extended you credit when times were hard. And I'm telling you now, as clearly as I can, that if you continue down this path, you're making an enemy of someone who knows exactly how much you owe and exactly how long you've owed it. The threat was delivered with perfect pleasantness, but it landed like a blow. Beckwith stared at her, his jaw working. Then he looked at Caleb, at the house, at the 2 girls watching from the porch. His shoulders sagged slightly, the fight going out of him. The week isn't up yet, he said finally. I'll return in 4 days to verify that this arrangement is legitimate and ongoing. You do that, Eliza said. We'll be happy to receive you. During reasonable hours, with reasonable notice. Beckwith mounted his horse with stiff dignity. His companions followed suit, and together they rode away without another word. When they were gone, Caleb let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for hours. I can't believe you just threatened the county commissioner, he said. Eliza turned to him with a small smile. I didn't threaten him. I simply reminded him of certain facts that might influence his decision-making. With the account ledger. A businesswoman's best weapon. She looked up at him, her expression softening. Are you all right? Better than all right. You were... He stopped, seeming to search for words. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did. He was questioning our marriage, which means he was questioning my choice and my integrity. I don't take kindly to either. She glanced toward the porch where Lena and Molly still stood. And nobody threatens children under my protection. The words under my protection seemed to settle something in Caleb's expression. He reached out, hesitated, then gently took Eliza's hand. Thank you, he said quietly. Eliza squeezed his hand once before letting go. We're in this together now. That's what marriage means, even one like ours. And watching them from the porch, Lena thought that maybe, just maybe, this strange arrangement might actually work. The 4 days that followed unfolded with a careful choreography that none of them had rehearsed, but all of them understood was necessary. Eliza moved through the house like she was learning a new language, one spoken in the placement of coffee cups and the rhythm of morning chores. She rose before dawn to start the stove, her hands quick and efficient as she mixed batter for pancakes or kneaded dough for bread. She asked Lena where things were kept instead of assuming, listened when Molly chattered about the chickens, and gave Caleb space when his silences grew too heavy to interrupt. In return, Caleb made room for her in ways that were small but significant. He cleared a shelf in the kitchen for her spices and cooking tools. He fixed the latch on the spare room door without being asked. He started setting 4 places at the table instead of waiting for someone else to do it. And when Eliza came in from hanging laundry, he poured her coffee without comment and set it where she could reach it. They were building something, Lena realized. Not love, not yet, maybe not ever, but partnership, understanding, the kind of foundation that might hold weight if they were careful with it. On the second day, Eliza brought Lena and Molly into town with her. "People need to see us together," she explained as they climbed into the buggy. "Need to see that this is real, that I'm taking my role seriously." The ride into town was quiet, except for the creak of wheels and the steady clip of hooves against packed earth. Lena watched the landscape roll past, endless stretches of dry grass broken by fence posts and the occasional windmill, the sky so wide and pale it seemed to swallow everything beneath it. When they reached the main street, people stopped what they were doing to stare. Mrs. Patterson, standing outside the post office with a package in her hands, went still as a deer. Mr. Chen, sweeping the boardwalk in front of his restaurant, paused mid-stroke. Even the children playing in the alley between buildings fell silent, their eyes tracking the buggy's progress. Eliza kept her chin up and her expression pleasant, nodding to people as they passed. She pulled the buggy to a stop in front of the general store, tied off the reins, and helped both girls down with the kind of gentle attention any mother might show. "Come on," she said quietly. "Let's show them there's nothing to hide." The store was exactly what Lena expected. Shelves stocked with dry goods and fabric, barrels of flour and sugar lined against one wall, tools and hardware hanging from hooks near the ceiling. The air smelled like coffee and leather and the faint sweetness of penny candy. A young woman stood behind the counter, her eyes going wide when she saw Eliza enter. "Miss Rowan, Mrs. Hart, I didn't expect you today." "I wanted to introduce you properly to my daughters," Eliza said, and the word daughters rolled off her tongue like she'd been saying it for years. "Lena, Molly, this is Sarah Chen. She's going to be managing the store while I'm needed at home." Sarah's gaze moved from Eliza to the girls and back again, curiosity and confusion warring in her expression. "It's nice to meet you both." "Nice to meet you too," Lena said softly. They spent an hour in the store while Eliza went over the books with Sarah, explaining inventory and suppliers and the credit system she maintained for regular customers. Lena and Molly wandered the aisles, marveling at things they hadn't seen in months: real soap, ribbon in a dozen colors, jars of preserves that made Molly's mouth water. "Can we have some?" Molly whispered, pointing at the candy. "We don't have money," Lena reminded her. But Eliza must have heard because she appeared beside them with 2 peppermint sticks. "Consider it a welcome gift," she said, pressing them into the girls' hands. The bell above the door chimed, and Mrs. Patterson entered, her eyes immediately finding Eliza. "I heard the news," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "Congratulations on your marriage." "Thank you, Dorothy." "It was rather sudden, wasn't it?" Eliza smiled, the expression pleasant but with an edge sharp enough to cut. "When you know, you know." Mrs. Patterson's gaze shifted to Lena and Molly. "And you're taking on quite a responsibility, raising 2 children at your age." "I'm 32, not ancient, and they're wonderful girls." Eliza rested a hand on Lena's shoulder, the gesture protective. "I consider myself fortunate." "Still, there will be talk. You know how people are." "Oh, I know exactly how people are, Dorothy. But talk is just noise, and I've never been one to let noise dictate my choices." She tilted her head slightly. "Was there something you needed, or did you just come by to offer your unsolicited opinions on my life?" Mrs. Patterson's cheeks flushed. "I was going to purchase some thread. Sarah will help you with that. We were just leaving." They swept out of the store with a dignity that left Mrs. Patterson standing speechless behind them. Once outside, Eliza let out a long breath. "That woman has been trying to tell me how to live since I opened this store," she said. "It's rather satisfying to finally have grounds to tell her to mind her own business." Lena looked up at her. "Does it bother you? The talk?" Eliza considered the question as they walked back to the buggy. "It bothers me that people care more about appearances than actual kindness. But the talk itself? No. Let them talk. Words can't hurt you unless you give them permission." They made 2 more stops before leaving town, one at the dry goods supplier to arrange a standing order, and another at Reverend Michael's small house on the edge of town. The Reverend answered the door with flour on his hands and surprise on his face. "Mrs. Hart, what brings you by?" "I wanted to thank you properly for performing the ceremony," Eliza said, "and to ask if you might be willing to provide a written statement confirming the marriage, should anyone official request verification." Understanding dawned on the Reverend's weathered face. "Commissioner Beckwith is still making trouble? He's promised to return in 2 days to verify our arrangement is legitimate." "I see." The Reverend wiped his hands on his apron. "Of course I'll provide a statement. The marriage was entirely legal and proper, whatever his concerns might be." "Thank you. That means a great deal." As they climbed back into the buggy for the ride home, Molly spoke up from the back seat. "Why does everyone care so much about whether you're really married or not?" Eliza was quiet for a moment, guiding the horse back onto the main road before answering. "Because people are afraid of things that don't fit into neat categories. A widow running a business by herself, that they can understand. A widower raising 2 orphan children, that makes them uncomfortable. So they look for reasons to intervene, to put things back in order the way they think it should be." "But that's not fair," Molly said. "No, sweetheart, it's not fair at all." That evening, after supper had been cleared and dishes washed, Lena found Caleb on the porch working on another carving. This one looked like it might become a rabbit, though it was still rough and unfinished. "Can I sit?" she asked. He nodded, and she settled onto the steps beside him, drawing her knees up to her chest. "Eliza took us into town today," she said. "I heard. How did it go?" People stared. Mrs. Patterson said some things that weren't very kind. Caleb's jaw tightened, but he kept his attention on the wood. "Eliza handle it?" "Better than I would have." Lena paused. "She called us her daughters." The knife stilled in Caleb's hands. "How did that make you feel?" Lena wasn't sure how to answer. She'd had a mother, a real mother who'd given birth to her and Molly, who'd loved them in the ways she'd been capable of loving anyone. That woman was gone, buried behind a house that was already starting to fade in Lena's memory. And here was Eliza, stepping into a role she hadn't asked for, claiming them with a certainty that was both comforting and terrifying. "Strange," Lena said finally. "But not bad strange, just different." Caleb nodded slowly. "She's trying. We all are." "Do you think it'll work, this whole arrangement?" He set down the carving and turned to look at her properly. "I think we're going to make it work, because the alternative isn't acceptable. Beckwith can question all he wants, but he can't take you away from a legal household with 2 married guardians who want you here." "Want?" Lena tested the word. "Do you want us here?" "Yes." The answer came without hesitation. "I didn't know I did until you showed up, but yes. This house needed life in it again. You and Molly gave it that." "And Eliza?" Something shifted in Caleb's expression, something complex that Lena couldn't quite read. She's more than I deserve, more than I expected. I'm grateful she was willing to do this. She seems to care about you, even if it's not romantic." "Maybe that's better. Romance fades. Respect and partnership, those can last if you work at them." Lena thought about her parents, about the way her father had left when she was too young to remember, and her mother had never really recovered. Maybe Caleb was right. Maybe the quiet, steady building of something practical was more valuable than the burning intensity of passion that could consume and destroy. The sound of the door opening made them both turn. Eliza stood in the doorway, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the cooling air. "Mind if I join you?" she asked. "Please," Caleb said, shifting over to make room. Eliza sat down on Caleb's other side, her hands folded in her lap. For a while, none of them spoke. They just sat there watching the sun sink lower, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. "I've been thinking," Eliza said finally, "about what happens after Beckwith's visit, assuming he accepts the marriage and leaves us alone." "What about it?" Caleb asked. "We should make this official in other ways, too. I should formally adopt the girls. Legal papers that establish them as my daughters in the eyes of the law, not just socially." Lena's breath caught. "You'd do that?" "If you want me to. If you think it would help you feel more secure." Eliza looked at her. "I know I'm not your mother. I can't replace her. But I can be someone who commits to you legally, who ensures you have protections even if something were to happen to Caleb or me." "What would that mean?" Lena asked. "The adoption." "It would mean that legally you'd be my children. You'd have the right to inherit, to use my name if you chose, to be protected by law as any child would be." Eliza's voice was gentle. "It would mean I couldn't walk away, even if I wanted to. Which I don't," she added quickly. "But it would make it binding." Lena looked at Caleb. "What do you think?" "I think it's Eliza's decision to make. And yours." His gaze moved between them. "But if you're asking my opinion, I think it's a good idea. The more legal standing we have, the harder it is for people like Beckwith to challenge us." Molly appeared in the doorway then, her nightgown already on, her hair loose around her shoulders. "Is it bedtime?" "Soon," Eliza said. "Come here first." Molly padded over and climbed into Eliza's lap, like she'd done it 100 times before. Eliza wrapped her arms around the small girl, resting her chin on top of Molly's head. "We were just talking about making some things official," Eliza said. "About me adopting you and your sister, if that's something you'd want." Molly was quiet, thinking. "Would we call you Mother?" "You could call me whatever feels right to you, Mother, Mama, Eliza, whatever you're comfortable with." "Can I still remember my real mother?" Eliza's arms tightened around her. "Oh, sweetheart, you should always remember her. She brought you into this world and loved you. Nothing about me adopting you changes that or takes that away." Molly nodded against Eliza's shoulder. "Then I think I'd like it. The adoption." "Me too," Lena said quietly. Eliza's eyes were bright with unshed tears when she looked at them both. "Then we'll make it happen. After we deal with Beckwith, we'll go to a lawyer and do it properly." That night, Lena lay in bed thinking about names and belonging, about how a piece of paper could transform strangers into family. She thought about Eliza, who'd stepped into their lives with such certainty, and Caleb, who'd opened his home to 2 lost girls without knowing what it would cost him. She thought about the word mother, and how it could mean so many different things. The woman who birthed you, the woman who raised you, the woman who chose you when she didn't have to. Maybe family wasn't about blood at all. Maybe it was about the people who stayed when leaving would have been easier. The 4th day arrived with a weight of anticipation that made the air feel thick and hard to breathe. Eliza had been up since before dawn, cleaning the house until it gleamed, preparing food that filled the kitchen with smells of fresh bread and roasted chicken. She'd washed the curtains, swept the porch, even convinced Caleb to trim his beard and put on his good shirt. "We want to look like a proper family," she said when Caleb protested that he was fine as he was. "We are a proper family." "I know that, but Beckwith needs to believe it too." Lena and Molly wore their best dresses, hand-me-downs from Eliza that had been carefully altered to fit. Eliza had brushed their hair until it shone, tying ribbons at the ends in a way that made Molly spin in circles to watch them flutter. They were ready an hour before Beckwith was expected to arrive. Lena stood at the window watching the road, her stomach churning with nerves. Beside her, Molly fidgeted with her ribbon, twisting it around her fingers until Lena gently stilled her hands. "What if he doesn't believe us?" Molly whispered. "Then we deal with it," Lena said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. Caleb and Eliza sat at the table, their hands almost touching but not quite. There was a tension in both of them that spoke of how much rode on this visit, how precarious their safety still was, despite all they'd done to secure it. When the hoofbeats finally came, they all stood. Beckwith rode up alone this time, without his associates. He dismounted slowly, taking in the scene before him, the clean house, the tended garden, the family waiting on the porch in their Sunday clothes. "Commissioner," Caleb said evenly, "right on time." Mr. Hart, Mrs. Hart. Beckwith tipped his hat to Eliza. I've come to verify that your arrangement is continuing as claimed. Please come in, Eliza said, her voice warm but formal. We've prepared refreshments if you'd care for some. Beckwith followed them inside, his gaze cataloging everything. The four-place setting still on the table from breakfast, the women's apron hanging by the stove, the small pile of mending in a basket by the chair. Evidence of habitation, of lives being lived together. Eliza poured coffee and set out slices of fresh bread with butter and jam. She moved through the space with the ease of someone who belonged there, who knew where everything was kept without having to ask. The house looks well maintained, Beckwith said, accepting a cup. Thank you. We've been working together to make it comfortable for everyone. Eliza sat down beside Caleb, close enough that their shoulders touched. The girls have been helping tremendously. And how are you finding married life, Mrs. Hart? Busy, rewarding, different than I expected in some ways, exactly what I hoped for in others. She smiled at Caleb. My husband has been very patient with the adjustment. Beckwith's eyes narrowed slightly. And you're still managing the store? Sarah Chen has taken over daily operations. I go in twice a week to handle the books and ordering, but my primary residence is here now. She gestured around the room. As you can see. I'd like to see the rest of the house, if you don't mind. It was invasive, inappropriate, but Eliza stood without protest. Of course, let me show you around. She led him through the main floor, pointing out the kitchen where she cooked, the sitting room where they gathered in the evenings, the small washroom they'd added last year. Then upstairs to the girls' room with its 2 small beds and shared dresser, to Caleb's room with its larger bed and simple furnishings. When they reached the spare room at the end of the hall, Beckwith paused. This is your room, Mrs. Hart? It is. Separate from your husband's. For now, yes. Eliza's voice was calm, unbothered. As I explained during your last visit, we're taking the physical aspects of our marriage slowly given the circumstances under which it began. I'm sure you can understand that rushing into intimacy wouldn't be appropriate or comfortable for either of us. Beckwith's discomfort with the topic was visible. He cleared his throat. And the children? How are they adjusting? Why don't you ask them yourself? They returned downstairs to find Lena and Molly sitting with Caleb, both girls pressed close to his sides. When Beckwith entered, they looked up with identical expressions of wary politeness. Girls, Beckwith said, sitting down across from them. I'd like to ask you a few questions if that's all right. Lena nodded, her hand finding Molly's under the table. Are you happy here? Yes, sir, Lena said. Mrs. Hart has been kind to you? Yes, sir, very kind. And Mr. Hart? He's been good to us, Molly said, her voice small but clear. He taught me how to feed the chickens and gather eggs, and he's carving me a rabbit. Beckwith's expression softened slightly. I see. And do you feel safe here? Protected? Safer than we've ever been, Lena said, and the truth of it rang in her voice. They take care of us. They make sure we have enough to eat and warm beds, and her voice wavered. They make us feel like we matter. Something shifted in Beckwith's face. For just a moment, the official mask slipped, and Lena saw something else underneath. Maybe doubt, maybe recognition that he'd been wrong about what was happening here. Do you want to stay? He asked quietly. More than anything, Molly said. Beckwith sat back in his chair, his gaze moving from the girls to Caleb to Eliza. The silence stretched long and uncomfortable. Finally, he stood. I came here expecting to find evidence of impropriety, he said. What I've found instead is a family doing their best in difficult circumstances. He looked at Caleb. I was wrong to question your motives. You did a good thing, taking these girls in. And Mrs. Hart, he turned to Eliza, you've taken on a tremendous responsibility with grace and commitment. I apologize for doubting either of you. The apology hung in the air, unexpected and disarming. Does this mean we can stay? Lena asked, hardly daring to hope. This means I will file a report with the territorial office stating that you are in a stable, appropriate home with legal guardians who are meeting your needs. Beckwith picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the table. I won't be bothering you again. Eliza stood, extending her hand. Thank you, Commissioner. That's all we ever wanted, to be left in peace to care for our family. Beckwith shook her hand, then Caleb's. I hope you'll accept my apology. I was doing what I thought was right, but I let prejudice color my judgment. We all make mistakes, Caleb said quietly. What matters is being willing to admit them. After Beckwith rode away, the four of them stood on the porch watching until he disappeared completely from view. Then Molly let out a whoop of joy and threw her arms around Caleb's waist. We can stay. We really can stay. Caleb's hand came up to rest on her head, gentle and sure. That's right, little one. You're home. Lena felt tears burning in her eyes, relief so overwhelming it made her knees weak. Eliza's arm came around her shoulders, pulling her close. It's over, Eliza murmured. The worst of it is over. But even as she said it, they all knew the real work was just beginning. The work of building trust, of learning to be a family, of turning this arrangement of necessity into something genuine and lasting. That work would take time, patience, grace for mistakes, and room for growth. That evening, after supper had been eaten and cleared, they gathered in the sitting room. Caleb sat in his chair with Molly curled up on the floor at his feet, working on the rabbit carving with small, careful strokes. Eliza occupied the settee with her mending basket, her hands moving in the familiar rhythm of needle and thread. Lena sat by the window with a book Eliza had brought from the store, the words swimming on the page as she struggled to concentrate. I've been thinking, Caleb said into the comfortable quiet, about what comes next. The adoption papers, Eliza said, not looking up from her sewing. That, yes, but also about making this place feel more permanent for all of us. He set down his knife and wood. The spare room, your room, Eliza, it's fine for now, but it's not really set up for long-term living. We should make it more comfortable, and the girls' room could use some work too. Maybe build them a proper wardrobe, get some curtains that actually keep out the cold. That would be lovely, Eliza said softly. And we should think about expansion. Maybe add another room or two. As the girls get older, they'll want their own spaces. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Lena had learned meant he was uncertain. If that's something you'd all want. You mean staying here long term, Lena said, growing up here. I mean making this your home in every sense of the word. Not just the place you're staying until something better comes along, but the place you belong. Molly looked up from her spot on the floor. Can we paint my room? I've always wanted a yellow room. Eliza laughed, the sound warm and genuine. I think we can manage that. And maybe a real bookshelf for Lena, Caleb added, instead of that stack of boards in the corner. I'd like that, Lena said quietly. Plans began to flow then, ideas for improvements and changes, ways to make the house reflect the family they were becoming rather than the people they'd been before. Through it all, Lena felt something loosening in her chest, some knot of fear and uncertainty that had been pulled tight for so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. Later, as she and Molly got ready for bed, Molly asked the question Lena had been wondering herself. Do you think they'll really stay together, Caleb and Eliza? Lena thought about the way they'd stood together against Beckwith, the easy partnership that had developed between them, the small kindnesses they showed each other when they thought no one was watching. I think they might, she said. Not because they have to anymore, but because they want to. Because they love each other? Maybe not yet, but I think they could learn to. The kind of love that's built on respect and trust and choosing each other every day. Lena pulled the covers up over them both. Sometimes that's better than the kind that burns hot and fast. Molly was quiet, considering this. Then, I'm glad we found them. Me too. Do you think Mama would be happy that we're here with them? The question made Lena's throat tight. She thought about their mother, about how hard she'd tried in those last years, how much she'd wanted better for her daughters, even when she couldn't provide it herself. I think she'd be relieved, Lena said finally. I think she'd be glad we're safe and cared for and have a chance at a real life. Molly nodded, satisfied. Within minutes, her breathing had evened out into the deep rhythm of sleep. But Lena lay awake longer, listening to the sounds of the house settling around her. Downstairs, she could hear the low murmur of voices. Caleb and Eliza talking quietly about something she couldn't make out. The sound was comforting in its ordinariness, a reminder that they were building something here that was worth protecting. She thought about the summer that had brought her and Molly to this ranch, about how desperate and terrified they'd been. She thought about Caleb finding them in the barn, about his gruff kindness and the way he'd made space for them in his solitary life. She thought about Eliza appearing like an answer to a prayer they hadn't known how to pray, offering partnership and protection when they'd needed it most. And she thought about tomorrow, and all the tomorrows that would follow, about yellow paint and bookshelves, about adoption papers and legal names, about the slow, steady work of becoming a family. Outside, the wind moved through the grass with a sound like whispered promises. Inside, in a house that had once been too quiet and too empty, 4 people were learning what it meant to belong to each other, and for the first time in longer than Lena could remember, that felt like enough. The weeks that followed Beckwith's departure brought changes both subtle and profound, like watching ice break on a river in early spring, slowly at first, then all at once in places you didn't expect. Caleb started the renovations on a Saturday morning, measuring and cutting wood for the bookshelf he'd promised Lena. She watched from the doorway as he worked, the careful precision of his movements reminding her that he was a man who built things to last. When he caught her watching, he didn't send her away. Instead, he showed her how to measure twice and cut once, how to test the joints for strength, how to sand until the wood felt smooth as riverstone under her fingers. "You're good at this," he said, examining her work. "Got steady hands." The compliment warmed her more than it probably should have. Eliza spent those same weeks transforming the house in quieter ways. She brought fabric from the store, yellow gingham for Molly's curtains, deep blue for Lena's, cream muslin for the kitchen. She taught both girls to sew, guiding their hands through simple stitches that gradually became more complex. On the evenings when Caleb worked late mending fences or tending to sick cattle, the 3 of them would sit together in the lamplight, needles flashing, conversation flowing in easy currents. "My mother taught me to sew when I was about your age," Eliza said one evening, helping Molly unpick a crooked seam. "She said it was the kind of skill that would serve me well no matter what life brought." "Was she right?" Molly asked. "More than she knew. When my husband died and left me with the store, being able to mend and alter clothes meant I could stretch every dollar further." She smiled. "And now I'm teaching you, so maybe she was right about more than just the practical parts." Lena watched the way Eliza's hands moved over Molly's work, gentle and patient, and felt something shift inside her chest. This was what mothering looked like when it wasn't tangled up in desperation and grief. This was what it meant to have someone invest in your future, to believe you were worth the time it took to teach you things properly. The adoption papers came through on a Tuesday afternoon in late summer. Lena and Molly had accompanied Eliza into town for the final signing, riding in the buggy with a mixture of excitement and nervousness that made conversation difficult. The lawyer's office was small and stuffy, crammed with books and papers that spilled across every available surface. The lawyer himself was a thin man with spectacles that kept sliding down his nose, but his manner was kind as he explained what each document meant. "This legally establishes Mrs. Hart as your mother and guardian," he said, pointing to the relevant sections. "Should anything happen to Mr. Hart, you would remain in her care. And should anything happen to Mrs. Hart, custody would default to Mr. Hart as your stepfather." "What about our real last name?" Lena asked quietly. The lawyer looked at her over his spectacles. "You have a choice. You can keep your birth surname, or you can take Mrs. Hart's married name. Either way, the adoption is legally binding." Lena glanced at Molly, then at Eliza. "What do you think we should do?" Eliza reached across the table and took both girls' hands. "That's entirely your decision. Your birth name connects you to your mother, to where you came from. There's no shame in wanting to keep that connection." "But Hart connects us to you and Caleb," Molly said slowly, "to where we are now." "It does." Lena thought about it, weighing the past against the present, memory against belonging. Finally, she said, "I'd like to be Lena Hart, if that's all right." "Me too," Molly added. "Molly Hart sounds nice." Eliza's eyes went bright with unshed tears. She squeezed their hands once, hard, then turned to the lawyer. "Then that's what we'll do." They signed the papers with hands that trembled slightly, making their marks beside Eliza's flowing signature. When it was done, the lawyer stamped each document with an official seal and handed them copies to keep. Congratulations, he said warmly. You're officially a family now. Walking out of that office, Lena felt different somehow. Lighter, maybe, or more substantial. Like she'd been floating untethered for so long that having her feet finally touch solid ground felt strange and wonderful all at once. On the ride home, Molly chattered endlessly about what it meant to have a new last name, about how she'd sign her schoolwork next term, about whether they should have a celebration. But Lena was quiet, watching the familiar landscape roll past and thinking about how the same view could look entirely different when you knew you belonged to it. When they arrived back at the ranch, Caleb was waiting on the porch. He must have seen the expression on Eliza's face because he stood up quickly, concern crossing his features. Everything all right? Better than all right, Eliza said, climbing down from the buggy. She pulled the adoption papers from her bag and held them up. It's official. Meet Lena Hart and Molly Hart. Something transformed in Caleb's expression. Relief and joy, and something deeper that Lena didn't have words for yet. He came down the steps and knelt in front of both girls, eye level with them. That means you're stuck with us now, he said, his voice rough with emotion. No takebacks. Molly threw her arms around his neck. Good. I don't want takebacks. Lena hung back slightly, but Caleb opened his other arm and she found herself stepping into the embrace. His arms closed around them both, strong and steady, and Lena let herself lean into it. Let herself trust that this was real, that it would last, that she didn't have to hold herself separate and ready to run anymore. When they finally pulled apart, Eliza was wiping her eyes with the corner of her apron. I think this calls for a celebration, she said. How about we have a proper family dinner tonight? I'll make my grandmother's roast chicken recipe. Can I help? Molly asked. I'm counting on it. That evening, as the four of them gathered around the table laden with food they'd prepared together, Lena looked at each face in the lamplight and felt the truth of what they'd become settle into her bones. This was her family now. Not by blood, not even entirely by choice at first, but by the thousand small decisions they made every day to show up for each other, to stay even when things got hard, to build something worth keeping. Caleb raised his glass of water in a toast, to new beginnings and legal documents that make them official. To family, Eliza added, her eyes finding each of theirs in turn. However we find it. They clinked glasses, and the sound rang out clear and true in the warm kitchen. As summer gave way to autumn, the rhythms of their life together deepened and became more assured. Lena started helping Eliza with the store's bookkeeping, showing an aptitude for numbers that surprised them both. Molly began accompanying Caleb on his morning rounds of the ranch, learning the names of the horses and how to check fence lines for damage. They were finding their places, their purposes, their ways of contributing to the whole. But it was in the small, unremarkable moments that Lena saw the real transformation happening. It was Caleb reaching for Eliza's hand one evening as they sat on the porch, the gesture so natural neither of them seemed to notice they'd done it. It was Eliza humming while she cooked, a sound that had been absent those first careful weeks. It was the way they'd started saying we instead of I, making plans and decisions as a unit rather than as separate people sharing space. One morning in October, Lena came downstairs early to find Caleb and Eliza in the kitchen together. Caleb stood at the stove making coffee while Eliza leaned against the counter beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. They were talking quietly about something mundane, supplies they needed from town, whether to slaughter one of the hogs before winter, but there was an intimacy to it that made Lena pause in the doorway. Then Caleb said something that made Eliza laugh, and he turned toward her with a smile that transformed his whole face. And Eliza looked up at him with an expression that was unmistakably affection, maybe even the beginning of love. Lena backed away quietly, not wanting to intrude. But as she climbed the stairs back to her room, she felt a satisfaction bloom in her chest. They were going to be all right. All of them. What had started as a desperate arrangement was becoming something real, something chosen, something that would hold. The first snow came in mid-November, transforming the ranch into something from a storybook. Molly woke before dawn and pressed her face against the window, her breath fogging the glass as she watched fat flakes drift down from a pewter sky. "Lena, look! It's snowing!" They tumbled downstairs in their nightgowns to find Caleb already stoking the fire and Eliza making hot chocolate, a treat she'd been saving for the first real cold day. "Can we go out in it?" Molly begged. "After breakfast and after you're properly dressed," Eliza said firmly. "I won't have you catching your death." An hour later, bundled in coats and scarves that Eliza had sewn from wool she'd ordered special from Denver, all four of them stood in the yard watching the world turn white. Molly caught snowflakes on her tongue while Lena tilted her face up to the sky, feeling the cold kiss of winter on her cheeks. Caleb showed them how to make snowballs, and before long a full battle had erupted, with Molly and Caleb on one side and Lena and Eliza on the other. They fought until they were breathless and soaked through, until Eliza called a truce and herded everyone back inside for dry clothes and more hot chocolate. That night, with the snow still falling softly outside and the fire crackling in the hearth, they gathered in the sitting room. Molly was supposed to be working on her letters, but she kept getting distracted by the window. Lena had her sewing, though her stitches had gotten slower and less certain as the evening wore on. Caleb worked on a new carving, a pair of boots small enough to fit in the palm of his hand, and Eliza sat in her chair with her mending, occasionally glancing up to smile at something one of them said or did. "I've been thinking," Caleb said into the comfortable quiet. Eliza looked up. About? About what we talked about, back when all this started. He set down his carving, suddenly serious. About this being a marriage of convenience, a practical arrangement. The room went very still. Lena's hands froze on her sewing. "And?" Eliza's voice was carefully neutral. "And I don't think that's what we have anymore. If it ever really was." Caleb stood up and crossed to where Eliza sat, kneeling down beside her chair so they were eye level. Somewhere along the way, this stopped being about keeping up appearances or protecting the girls. It became about us, about wanting to build something together not because we have to, but because we want to. Eliza's hand came up to rest against his cheek, tender and sure. "When did you figure that out?" "Probably weeks ago, maybe longer. I've just been too much of a coward to say it." He covered her hand with his. "I love you, Eliza. Not the way I loved my first wife. This is different, built on different foundations. But it's real and it's strong, and I don't want to keep pretending it's something less than it is." Tears slipped down Eliza's cheeks, but she was smiling. "I was beginning to think you'd never notice." "You knew?" "I've known for a while. I was just waiting for you to catch up." She leaned forward and kissed him, soft and sweet and full of promise. When they pulled apart, they both seemed to remember they had an audience. They turned to find Lena and Molly watching with matching grins. "Does this mean you're really married now?" Molly asked. "Not just on paper?" Caleb laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "Yeah, little one, I guess it does." "About time," Lena said, and everyone laughed. That night, after the girls had gone to bed, Lena heard footsteps in the hall. She crept to the door and cracked it open just enough to see Caleb carrying a lamp toward the spare room at the end of the hall. He knocked softly, and when Eliza opened the door, he said something too quiet for Lena to hear. Eliza smiled and stepped back, letting him in. The door closed, and Lena returned to her bed with a satisfaction that ran bone deep. They were really a family now, in every sense that mattered. Winter deepened, bringing with it the kind of cold that made your breath freeze in the air and turned the water in the horse trough to solid ice. But inside the house, warmth prevailed. They spent long evenings together, telling stories and playing simple games, teaching each other things they'd learned in their separate lives before they'd become intertwined. Caleb taught Lena how to whittle, showing her the way wood grain directed where your knife should cut. Eliza taught Molly to braid bread dough, creating loaves that looked almost too pretty to eat. The girls taught the adults songs their mother had sung to them, keeping those memories alive even as they built new ones. On Christmas Eve, they decorated the house with pine boughs and strings of popcorn that Molly had carefully threaded. Caleb had cut down a small pine tree and set it up in the corner, and Eliza had produced paper ornaments she'd been secretly making for weeks. They hung them together while snow fell outside and the fire crackled warm. "I have something for you all," Caleb said when the tree was finished. He disappeared into his workshop and returned carrying 4 small objects wrapped in cloth. He handed the first to Eliza, who unwrapped it to find a carved wooden box with her initials on the lid. Inside, the wood was lined with soft fabric, a jewelry box made with such care that Eliza's breath caught. Caleb, it's beautiful. For all the important things you'll want to keep safe. He gave Molly the rabbit he'd been carving, finally finished and sanded smooth. She clutched it to her chest with delight. I'm going to name her Snowflake. For Lena, he'd made a bookend carved with flowers and vines, intricate and delicate. For all those books you're collecting, figure you'll need something to keep them organized. Thank you, Lena said softly, running her fingers over the detailed carving, the fourth wrapped object he set on the mantel above the fireplace. When he unwrapped it, they saw it was the carving he'd been working on for weeks, a pair of small boots, perfectly detailed down to the laces. What does it mean? Molly asked. Caleb looked at them all, his expression soft. It's to remember two girls who walked barefoot down a dusty road one summer morning and changed everything. Eliza's hand found his, their fingers intertwining. We should put it somewhere we'll see it every day. Above the hearth, Lena suggested, right there in the center. And that's where it went, a permanent reminder of where they'd started and how far they'd come. The winter passed in a cocoon of domestic contentment. There were hard days, certainly, days when Molly was sick and Eliza spent sleepless nights tending to her, days when a blizzard kept them housebound and cabin fever made tempers short, days when Lena woke from nightmares about being taken away and had to be reminded that she was safe, that she was home, that no one was coming to separate them. But there were far more good days. Days when Caleb taught Molly to ice skate on the frozen pond, both of them falling more often than they stayed upright. Days when Eliza and Lena worked side by side in the kitchen, creating meals that filled the house with warmth and good smells. Days when all four of them piled into the big bed in what had become Caleb and Eliza's shared room, reading aloud from books Eliza brought from town until their voices grew hoarse and their eyes heavy. They were becoming the thing they'd pretended to be. Or maybe they'd been that thing all along and were only now allowing themselves to believe it. Spring came late that year, reluctant to release winter's grip. But when it finally arrived, it brought with it a softness to the air and the first brave shoots of green pushing through the snow. One morning in April, Lena woke to find sunshine streaming through her window and the sound of birds singing outside. She dressed quickly and went downstairs to find the whole family already awake, drawn outside by the promise of warmer weather. Caleb was in the garden plot behind the house, turning over soil that had been frozen solid for months. Eliza stood nearby with Molly, both of them holding packets of seeds and discussing what should go where. We'll need carrots and potatoes, Eliza was saying, and beans. Green beans and pole beans both. Maybe some squash if we have room. Can we plant flowers too? Molly asked. Just a few? Of course. A garden should have beauty as well as purpose. Lena joined them, and Eliza immediately handed her a packet of lettuce seeds. You and Molly can start with these. Make rows about this far apart, she demonstrated with her hands, and plant them shallow. They worked together through the morning, turning the earth and placing seeds with care, planning for a future that stretched months ahead. It was an act of faith, Lena realized. Planting something in April meant believing you'd be there in July to harvest it. It meant trusting that the ground beneath your feet was solid, that the home you'd built would still be standing when the seasons turned again. When they finished, Caleb stood and stretched, his back cracking. He surveyed their work with satisfaction, neat rows marked with stakes, the dark earth promising eventual abundance. Should be a good year, he said. Eliza came to stand beside him, slipping her hand into his. Should be. They stood like that for a moment, the four of them in the spring sunshine, looking at what they'd planted together. Then Molly broke the spell by announcing she was starving, and could they please go inside for lunch? Over sandwiches and cold milk, Molly asked the question that had been building for weeks. When I start school in the fall, will people be mean about us? About how we're a family? The question hung in the air, bringing with it all the old fears about judgment and belonging. Caleb set down his sandwich and looked at her seriously. Some people might be. Some people struggle with things they don't understand or situations that don't fit their neat ideas about how the world should work. But that's their problem, not yours, Eliza added firmly. You are my daughter, legally and in every way that matters. You're Caleb's daughter. Anyone who has an issue with that can take it up with me, and I promise you, they won't like how that conversation goes. Besides, Lena said, surprising herself by speaking up, we know the truth. We know how we became a family and why, and that's more important than what anyone else thinks. Molly considered this, then nodded. Okay, but if anyone is mean to you, she pointed at Eliza and Caleb, I'll tell them they're wrong. That's my girl, Caleb said with a smile. That afternoon, while Caleb worked on expanding the chicken coop and Molly napped upstairs, Lena found Eliza in the sitting room mending a tear in one of Caleb's work shirts. Can I ask you something? Lena said, sitting down nearby. Of course. Do you ever regret it? Marrying Caleb like you did, taking us on? Eliza set down her mending and looked at Lena directly. Not for a single moment, not even on the hardest days. She paused. Why do you ask? Because it changed your whole life. You gave up living alone, running your store the way you wanted, having your own space and time. You took on a ready-made family with all its complications. That's a lot to give up. And what did I gain? Eliza asked gently. A partner who respects me and makes me laugh. 2 daughters who've taught me more about courage and resilience than I could have learned in a lifetime alone. A home that feels full instead of empty. A purpose beyond just getting through each day. She reached over and took Lena's hand. You didn't take anything from me, sweetheart. You gave me a life worth living. Lena felt tears burn behind her eyes. I love you. I should have said it before, but I do. You're the mother I needed. Eliza pulled her close, and Lena let herself be held the way she hadn't allowed herself to be held in so long. I love you too, Eliza whispered. So much. You and Molly, both. They stayed like that until Lena's tears subsided and she could breathe normally again. When she pulled back, Eliza wiped her cheeks with gentle hands. Better? Eliza asked. Yeah, better. The summer that followed was nothing like the summer that had brought Lena and Molly to the ranch. Where that season had been marked by heat and desperation and fear, this one was characterized by growth and laughter and the steady accumulation of ordinary happiness. The garden flourished under their combined care. Lettuce and radishes came first, crisp and fresh on the table. Then beans and peas, which Molly learned to pick and shell. The tomatoes grew heavy on their vines, and the squash spread across the ground in enthusiastic tangles. Caleb finished the chicken coop expansion and built Lena the bookshelf he'd promised, installing it in their room with space for the books she was slowly collecting. He also built a small desk beneath the window, a place where she could practice her writing and keep the journal Eliza had given her. Eliza divided her time between the ranch and the store with increasing confidence, trusting Sarah to handle more responsibilities while she focused on her family. Some weeks she spent 4 days at the ranch and only 1 in town. Other weeks she brought the girls with her, teaching them the intricacies of running a business and letting them interact with the townspeople who had slowly, reluctantly, come to accept this unconventional family. And Caleb and Eliza's relationship continued to deepen in ways both visible and private. They moved around each other with the easy synchronization of people who'd learned to read each other's needs and rhythms. They laughed more, touched more freely, looked at each other with an affection that had clearly evolved into love. One evening in August, almost exactly a year after Lena and Molly had first arrived, the 4 of them sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and rose. The air was warm but not oppressive, carrying with it the smell of sage and the distant sound of cattle lowing. Hard to believe it's been a year, Caleb said quietly. Feels like longer, Eliza said. In a good way, like we've always been this. Remember how scared we were? Lena asked, that first day when Molly and I showed up. I remember thinking I had no idea what I was doing, Caleb admitted. 2 girls I didn't know, appearing out of nowhere with nowhere else to go. I was terrified I'd make the wrong choice. But you didn't, Molly said. You made the best choice. We all did, Eliza corrected. Every choice we made, to stay, to marry, to fight for each other, every single one led us here. Lena looked at her family, because that's what they were, truly and completely, and felt a peace so profound it took her breath away. They'd started as strangers brought together by desperation and circumstance. They'd become something far more precious. People who chose each other, who fought for each other, who loved each other not in spite of their complicated beginning, but because of it. Thank you, Lena said softly, for everything, for not turning us away, for making us part of this, for her voice caught, for giving us a home. Caleb stood and pulled both girls into a hug, Eliza joining them a moment later. They stood there in the fading light, arms wrapped around each other, and Lena knew with absolute certainty that this was where she belonged. When they finally separated, Caleb cleared his throat roughly. "I have one more thing to show you. Been working on it for weeks." He went inside and returned carrying something wrapped in cloth. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a wooden sign carved with neat letters. "The Hart Family. Tinan, 1875. "Thought we should make it official," he said. "This is our home and everyone should know it." Together, they hung the sign above the porch, right where anyone approaching the house would see it. And as they stepped back to admire it, Lena felt the last piece of uncertainty fall away. They weren't pretending anymore. They weren't playing at being a family or maintaining appearances for the sake of propriety. They were simply, genuinely, completely themselves. Four people who'd found each other when they needed it most and built something lasting from the broken pieces they'd brought together. That night, as Lena lay in bed listening to Molly's soft breathing beside her, she thought about journeys and destinations, about how sometimes the place you end up is better than anything you could have planned or imagined. They'd come to this ranch as refugees fleeing loss and hardship, with nothing but each other and the desperate hope that someone might show them kindness. They'd found a man haunted by his own grief, living half a life in a house too quiet and too empty. They'd found a woman tired of being alone, brave enough to take a chance on an unconventional arrangement. And together, imperfectly and uncertainly at first, they'd built something extraordinary. The carved boots above the hearth would always remind them of where they'd started, two barefoot girls walking down a dusty road with nothing left to lose. But the sign above the porch would remind them of what they'd become, a family forged not by blood or tradition, but by choice and courage, and the simple, radical act of showing up for each other every single day. Outside, the summer night was peaceful and warm. Inside, four people slept soundly, safe in the knowledge that they belonged to each other and to this place they'd made their own. And if you'd asked any of them what home meant, they would have answered without hesitation, this house, these people, this life they'd built together from hope and determination and love in all its unexpected forms. The summer they came home had been marked by heat and desperation. But the summers that followed and all the seasons in between would be marked by something far more valuable. The certainty that home was never about the season that brought you there, but about the choice to stay and the people who stayed with you. And they would stay. Through winters and summers, through hard times and good, through all the ordinary days and extraordinary moments that make up a life. They would stay because they'd learned what so many people never understand, that family isn't something you're born into, but something you build, brick by careful brick, until it's strong enough to shelter you from any storm. This was home. Not because it had always been, but because they'd made it so. And that, in the end, was the only thing that mattered.